So hello everybody, and welcome back for the next session. Welcome back for session 5. First of all, just again to apologize for the slight connectivity issues that I think some of you had in the last few minutes of that previous session. So apologies for that. We're hoping we've sorted those out, but just in case anyone still is experiencing any issues, just to remind you all that the whole event is being streamed live on Twitter and on YouTube. And I think my colleague Lula is going to be putting the links to access those two streams in the chat room now. So if anyone does still experience any issues, as I said, hopefully we've managed to sort that. But if there are still issues for anyone, then please do use one of those links and you'll be able to follow the event live on either Twitter or YouTube. So fingers crossed that will get you on. So that said, as I said, welcome back, and I hope everybody managed to make use of the networking area and make some new connections during the short break that we've had there. So following the discussions that we've had earlier on today, looking at WRC, I suppose we are still continuing WRC discussions in a way, given how key the issue of millimeter wave was at the last WRC 19, but we're actually widening things a lot further and are going to be looking much more broadly at the emerging millimeter wave ecosystem and the different technologies, different uses that are live within the millimeter wave bands. So we've got an excellent lineup of speakers, and so without further ado, I'd now like to start the session by introducing Hans. Hi Hans, how are you doing? Hans Seal from
Hello.
Hello there. So I'll pass over to you, Hans, to introduce our speakers, and we're looking forward to the session. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Hello and welcome everyone to this afternoon's session on millimeter wave spectrum. My name is Hans Eder. I'm an associate director with NERA, and I'm very excited to be hosting this session today. For the past 2 years, I've been helping mobile operators prepare for and bid in millimeter wave auctions in the US and in other countries. And during this time, the ecosystem and the use cases have developed a lot, and I'm excited to host a session today and to hear more about what's been happening in the region. Next slide, please. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the developments around millimeter wave are very exciting. Millimeter wave has enormous potential and will be a key enabler to deliver on the promises of 5G. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Jiran Jin from the GSA, who will give us an overview of the capabilities of 5G in millimeter wave, and show you a bit more about what the enormous amount of bandwidth can actually achieve. At the same time, for me, I think there are 3 key questions with regards to millimeter wave, which I will try and flesh out with the panel today. And the first one is, how should millimeter wave bands be shared with other users, in particular satellite? And this includes protection of existing use in bands, as well as in adjacent bands, and also potentially reserving particular bands for new investments by the satellite industry. And I'm joined here today by Chris Murphy from Viasat, and he'll give us the satellite industry's view on the outcomes of WRC 19, as well as their plans for the 28 gigahertz band. The second, there's still considerable uncertainty around the likely demand for this spectrum. 5G millimeter wave auctions so far have delivered a mixed picture. GS on the one hand has released a lot of millimeter wave spectrum in a very short space of time. And we saw some very intense bidding for emerging key bands, such as the 24, the 28, the 37 and 39, 37 to 39 gigahertz bands. And mobile operators there have actually acquired fairly large quantities of spectrum. So for example, Verizon won around a gigahertz of spectrum in the 37 to 39 gigahertz band. I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Sullivan from the FCC, who will give us an overview of recent developments in millimeter wave in the US. On the other hand, the auctions in Asia Pacific and in Europe have been a little bit less exciting. There's been very muted interest in these bands, with all of these auctions actually settling at or close to the reserve price, and with some operators actually willing to just walk away with around 200 to 400 megahertz of spectrum, which is much less than what operators in the US have acquired. Now, if there's little or no scarcity, there's obviously little point in running an auction. The question there is whether there are other mechanisms that should be used to allocate the spectrum. And I'm very keen to hear from Linda Yu from OFCA in Hong Kong on how they have allocated millimeter wave bands recently. As far as I understand, the spectrum there was effectively given away for free. Now, given its very short range and propagation characteristics, as well as the uncertainty over use cases, it's also unclear at this stage what the best geographic licensing area should be. Should it be site-based? Should it be regional? Should it be national with potentially subleasing? And I'm looking forward to Chris Ho's presentation on recent developments in Australia and how the ACMA are planning to allocate the 26 and 28 gigahertz band, taking into account the uncertain use cases there. My third and final concern is with regards to long-term efficiency. I mean, obviously, at the moment, the spectrum's mainly been bought by either companies who are looking to deploy FWA or mobile-centric bidders, which means that if all of the spectrum gets allocated today, it will likely end up in the hands of the established mobile incumbents. And the question there is, how do you ensure that once other use cases and potentially other users come along, how you ensure that they will get access to the spectrum? I mean, in the US, there's a fairly good track record with regards to secondary trading, but this is much less so the case in Europe and Asia Pacific. Alternative would be to stagger the release of these bands, but you would then be essentially looking at leaving some of these bands unallocated for a long time, which is clearly inefficient as well. The final alternative that I've mentioned here is the sort of sharing solutions, different approaches to sharing the spectrum. And as I understand, OFCA in Hong Kong, the FCC in the US, and the ACMA in Australia have all adopted slightly different authorization regimes with focus on sharing this band as well. Next slide, please. I've already covered the panelists today, but let me just run down the list here. They're in order of appearance. We're going to start off with Linda Yu from OFCA in Hong Kong. She'll give us an overview of the recent allocations of millimeter wave spectrum in Hong Kong. She'll be followed by Chris Howes from the ACMA in Australia. Chris will tell us a little bit more about the ACMA's plans for allocating the 26 and the 28 gigahertz bands. Tom Sullivan from the FCC will give a presentation on the recent allocations of millimeter wave spectrum in the US, as well as deployments. The satellite perspective will be delivered by Chris Murphy from Viasat in the USA, and the mobile perspective will be delivered by Jiran Jin from the GSA. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Linda now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hans, and hello everybody on the stage. And we can start looking at the 26 and 28 gigahertz band. How is it being arranged in Hong Kong now? The slides, please. Yeah, that's the introduction screen only. The next slide, please. And let's first look at the release of 5G spectrum in Hong Kong. After several rounds of consultation and taking into account the views we get back from the consultation, we released a total of 4,500 megahertz spectrum in 2019, and including the millimeter wave spectrum, 4,100 megahertz, and the mid-band spectrum. And this amount of spectrum is 8 times of the spectrums that we are using for the provision of 2G, 3G, and 4G services. So finally, with the spectrum assigned, we have the 5G services commercially launched in Hong Kong in April this year. And in this section, let's focus on the 26, 28 gigahertz band. Next slide, please. The first thing we have to do is to allocate the band to mobile service, because previously that is part of which is for fixed satellite use, and most of it are for fixed use. So you see the green band in the middle, that is the new allocation we made in order to put the spectrum for the provision of public mobile service. The way we do it is we assign it on a co-primary basis with together with mobile, fixed, and fixed satellite user on a first come first serve basis. That means the latecomers should protect or should not interfere with the existing users in the band. And let's look at how this band is being arranged. That is interesting because this is very different from all the other bands that I have worked on before. Next slide, please. The way that we assign it is you see there are two categories of spectrum here, the mid-band and the mmWave band, and the difference between them is one with competing demands. You see the middle green blue box and the middle brown box, the mid-band spectrum without competing demand. And according to the radio spectrum policy framework promulgated in 2007, the spectrum management policy of the government is that whenever there are competing demand for spectrum, a market-based approach should be used. But for the 26 and 28 gigahertz band, since we have 4,100 megahertz spectrum out there, and we have only 4 mobile operators, and from their expression of interest and from their feedback in consultation, our assessment is that there are unlikely to be competing demands for these 26, 28 gigahertz bands, and that's why we adopt an administrative approach for assignment. I would say this is not so familiar to us, because ever since the assignment of 3G spectrum in 2001, all our spectrum for the provision of public mobile service has been assigned by way of auction using the market-based approach. And that's why for this band, we have gone through many interesting internal discussion and debate how to make the assignment. And finally, we work out the arrangement. Next slide, please. We categorize the spectrum into 2 parts. As we know, the 5G spectrum could have many applications other than just enhanced mobile broadband service. For the bulk of it, the 3,700 megahertz, it is assigned on an exclusive basis for the provision of large-scale public mobile service. And because this is the by administrative assignment, we invite application, the first round of application at the end of 2018, and the spectrum was assigned a few months later in April last year. And for the remaining 400 megahertz of spectrum, it is for assignment on a geographically sharing basis. So it is the shared spectrum. And there is such a special arrangement because of the short range characteristic of this band, because it could be used by just some specific users at some specified location, like in the industrial estates, the airports, or the technology park. And that's why we categorize a part out that is for shared use, and the bulk of it is for non-shared use. And for the shared spectrum, the application opened since July last year, and it is an ongoing exercise. Next slide, please. And for the assignment of the non-shared spectrum, that is for the provision of public mobile service, we divide the 4,100 megahertz spectrum into 41,100 megahertz blocks. And then, since this is an administrative assignment, we ask the applicants to provide in their application the amount of spectrum they would like to apply for, subject to a cap of 800 megahertz. And as I said before, we don't expect excess demand or competing demand, but we don't know. And that's why we have to also prepare for that, because we have 4 mobile operators. And if every one of them apply for 800 megahertz, and in case a newcomer coming up then the total demand could exceed 3,700 megahertz. So we have developed a two-stage distribution mechanism in case the demand for spectrum exceed the 3,700 megahertz. Next slide, please. But in the end, we assigned only 1,200 megahertz to 3 of our mobile network operators. We know for the mmWave spectrum, the 800 megahertz band optimal. But they apply that 400 megahertz is assigned as per their application. All of them apply only for 400. I think one reason is because by the time we make the assignment arrangement, we announce the assignment arrangement, we said there will be a second round application in 2 years' time. So I think by the time they make the application, that is in late 2018 and early 2019, that is much more uncertainty surrounding the use of these mmWave span, like the availability of supporting equipment, and that's why our operators tends to be more conservative. And as with the assignment of spectrum in the other frequencies bands, to ensure low hoarding of spectrum, the rollout obligation have been imposed on the spectrum assignees, and which are made proportion to the amount of spectrum assigned. And for the assignment of 400 megahertz of spectrum, they are required to install a minimum of 2,500 radio units in total in 5 years' time. And taking into account the availability of equipment supporting the band, the rollout milestones were made progressive starting from the 3rd year only. And as usual, we also asked them to submit some performance bond to guarantee their network rollout. Next slide, please. And for the shared spectrum, it is a totally different thing. It is assigned on a geographically sharing basis with limit on the geographic coverage, that is 50 square kilometer, and it is intended to be for the provision of innovative 5G service to specific groups of users, like for use at the airport, science park, or university campus. The special arrangement for this part is that it is not allowed for assignment for use in the conventional public mobile service, not for assignment to MNO, and there's no rollout obligation. Next slide, please. And in the end, we have created the localized wireless broadband service license for assignment of this shared spectrum. And the first of this LWB license was assigned to the Hong Kong Airport Authority for implementation of its smart airport initiatives. Next slide, please. For spectrum utilization fees, since time is running out, I don't spend time on it. At the moment, the use of spectrum is not subject to charge or spectrum utilization fees. But when the usage of the band is up to 75%, it will be subject to a certain charge, the blue lines at the bottom. But even then, the level of SUF is not really high for this millimeter wave spectrum. Next slide, please. And that is the last one. So what's next? We will launch the second round of application for assignment of the remaining unassigned 2,005 megahertz of non-shared spectrum by the end of this year. And we will also continue to explore and encourage the use of the shared spectrum for provision of innovative service, like development of private 5G networks. And also, we will continue to issue trial permits to facilitate the testing and trial of the innovative use of the mmWave spectrum. And for this trial spectrum, they are, again, no SUF is required. I think I have not used up too much time. Thank you. Okay.
Hans, you're on mute. Hans, can you hear me? You're on mute. Okay.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Linda, for this very comprehensive overview. It's really interesting to see how Ofcom has adopted a mix of exclusive use and shared use in this band. It will be interesting to see how the shared use licenses are going to be used, and particularly at the airport. Looks like a very interesting new use case for the spectrum. I'd like to now hand over to Chris Host from the ACMA.
Okay, many thanks, Hans, and greetings to everyone. I hope you're doing as well as can be expected in these challenging times. And it's especially good to at least virtually see a number of colleagues who I normally would have caught up with by this time in a normal year around the world, but obviously that's not the case this year. I'm very happy to be on the panel today and provide some perspectives on millimetre wave spectrum from the Australian environment. And just listening to that presentation from Ofcom, it's interesting to hear that there's some very strong similarities, but also some very stark differences in how we're going about it. It's interesting to hear. So hopefully I can shed some light from the Australian perspective. Next slide, thanks. So given the time today, I'll quickly be fairly high level, and I'll focus on what we see as the opportunities of millimetre wave from the regulator's perspective, if you like, about in terms of uses, the coexistence discussions and issues, and the resulting regulation and spectrum management outcomes that enable. I'll focus specifically on 26 and 28 gigahertz in Australia. At the moment, when you talk about millimetre wave spectrum discussions, that's where the vast majority of the discussion is. And I'll talk about some of our planning, licensing and allocation decisions and conclude with where we're going, what's next. We're sort of in the middle of quite a number of substantive activities in both the 26 and 28 gigahertz band, leading towards allocations in the relatively near future. So next slide, please. So the first point here is sort of as a spectrum manager, the key point is millimetre wave isn't your standard spectrum management scenario. Often this isn't a good thing if you're a spectrum manager. Uniqueness in the spectrum management game obviously usually means challenges. But in the millimetre wave bands, I think we're seeing more opportunities than difficulties at the moment. It's not without its challenges, but the opportunities are very, very strong. This is due to a number of reasons. The amount of spectrum, we're talking gigahertz rather than hundreds of megahertz at best, 100 megahertz at best in the lower bands. Propagation characteristics, while a challenge in terms of coverage, is very conducive to technical coexistence in a number of occasions, which is handy. Some of the use cases and deployment characteristics also help with that coexistence. And in some regards, at least, the current uses of the bands are fairly modest. Not all across all of the bands, but in some cases it is, and that also helps. So given the number of use cases and the types of uses, satellite and terrestrial, and different users expected in the band, these opportunities have been most welcome. So for the Australian perspective, at least, the decisions in the 26 and 28 gigahertz band, while not simple and not without its challenges, it has been probably a little bit smoother than in some other bands in the lower bands where there's less spectrum, greater contestability, and greater incumbency issues. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about the specific outcomes in the next slide, please. So for 26 and 28, we've got the band definitions down there. It's probably fairly consistent across the globe. We reviewed both bands in over 2018 and 2019, driven by satellite and terrestrial interest in the band, technology standardization, the spectrum harmonization discussions. We came to the view that the time was right in about 2018 to start the process, and concluded, at least at the high-level planning decisions in 2019. So in the review, like most countries, satellite and terrestrial broadband interests were key. And Australia and the ACMA, as a national regulator, we were heavily involved in the coexistence studies, the technical work to determine what could and couldn't work, particularly between the satellite and terrestrial interests, which were obviously a major discussion, the 26 gigahertz band, at least during WRC 19, Agenda Item 1.13. So we were very heavily involved in that, contributed some studies to the international discussions on that as well. One thing in terms of beyond the different uses of the band between satellite and terrestrial, which has been discussed and mentioned a lot already, of course, there's been the different type of use cases for the terrestrial side of things, particularly. So the different use cases and the users. So terminology is different around the world, but the way we looked at it is there was the conventional wide area subscriber networks. So think the major telcos, MNOs running their mobile networks. Limited market, more area subscriber networks. So these were smaller area providers, often called WISPs, wireless ISPs. So they're not providing services nationwide, but they're looking for spectrum and opportunities to provide more localized services. So that was one characteristic, one user group in mind as well. And also the private enterprise network. So over the very localized areas at a university or a hospital or a port or an airport. So for example, and one of the key things here was each of these type of users really benefits from different planning, licensing and allocation arrangements. And in 26 and 28, we saw some opportunities to optimize arrangements for all users and use types. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we concluded the process at a planning level and made the broad decisions last year. The outcome was to support a mix of satellite and terrestrial users and users across the band. Terrestrial broadband throughout both 26 and 28 under a mix of licensing and status arrangements in terms of primary and secondary, but we have limited the terrestrial side to fixed only above 27.5. And satellite has been supported under a mix of licensing arrangements above 27 gigahertz as well. The next couple of slides, I'll go into a little bit more details about there's variations about what's possible in what geographies and what parts of the band, but at a broad level, that's where we landed. One of the sort of key outcomes, at least for the terrestrial broadband side of things, was the development of new area-wide licenses. Rather than more sort of site-specific approaches, we thought there were some opportunities to create more geographically and spectrally scalable licenses, flexible use and an administrative allocation process. And that's now supporting or being investigated and developed through consultation processes expected over the rest of the year for both terrestrial and satellite type uses, which will be further discussions with industry in the coming months. Next slide, please. So at a high level, this is where we got to. There's a fair bit going on in this diagram, so please don't try and read all the A's and C's and S's there. The key point is that there are different colours illustrating the different licensing and allocation approaches adopted in different geographies and parts of the spectrum. Yellow is what we're calling class licenses. Think license exempt or unlicensed in some parts of the world. Green is what we call spectrum licenses, which are the wider area long-term licenses that are usually allocated at auction, often used by mobile network operators, for example, for supporting their network deployments. And blue is what we call apparatus licensing, is a regime to support more localized licenses. In some cases, there's also other class licensing arrangements in the upper end of the band to support satellite as well. But this gives an overview of the broad mix of arrangements across the band. Next slide, please. So this is a quick picture of the areas that will be being consulted on for allocation via auctions, the spectrum licensed areas. Key thing here is obviously it's not covering the whole country. It's not even covering regional parts of the country. It's really focusing on major population centres. Around 27 areas are being considered, which, while covering very little geography of the country, obviously, if you know the geography of Australia and the cities, it covers most of the population centres. So about 20 out of the 25 million people in Australia are covered. Often we issue licences nationwide or via regional licences. And outside these areas, licences will be available over the counter or through administrative means. Just quickly wrapping up, next steps, we've already done some work on satellites, class licence arrangements supporting ubiquitous terminals. As I mentioned before, apparatus licence arrangements for wireless broadband and earth stations are planned to commence later this year with an allocation of the spectrum licences that I just showed the geographies for first half of next year. And then in terms of millimetre wave, what's next? Probably 40, 46, 47 gigahertz is probably the next cabs off the rank. Satellite and terrestrial interests, but we haven't yet committed to that. It's just on the radar, if you like. So with that, I might stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That's a very interesting overview, and I think, it's exciting times ahead in Australia. I mean, you've got the auction coming up, I believe, next year, and it'll be interesting to see how these different licenses, like the apparatus licenses and the spectrum licenses, how they're going to be used and how they're going to be to whom they're going to be allocated. Thank you very much. And I'd like to now hand over to Tom Sullivan from the FCC to give us an overview of what's been going on in the millimeter wave bands in the US.
Great, thank you very much, Hans. If we can start the slide presentation, and we can go right to the next slide, please. Thank you. Thanks again, Hans, for that, and thank you for Forum Global for inviting me. I hope all of my international colleagues and counterparts are doing well and staying safe. Next slide, please. And so the FCC's first mission is to help ensure that every American can access advanced communications. As we all know and we've heard, digital opportunity is opening up new possibilities for everyone. At the same time, the FCC also aims to promote innovation and investment across all of the communication sectors. And with each new breakthrough that we're seeing, we increase the value of being connected. We're unlocking opportunities to improve the lives of our citizens and of our businesses. The 5G ecosystem is an essential component to our advanced communications network in the future, not just in the US, but globally. And it'll be central to every issue that we face. It's going to be essential to economic growth, job creation. It's going to be essential to transportation and agriculture and industry automation. And as you're seeing in response to the global pandemic, where homes are becoming classrooms, offices, and health clinics, it's going to be essential to healthcare and education. From an economic perspective, as you've probably heard in other sessions so far, the global economic impact of 5G will be $12 trillion in 2035, some estimates that are out right now. Next slide, please. To realize this potential of 5G, the FCC has developed and is executing what we call the 5G Fast Plan. It has three parts: freeing up more spectrum for the commercial marketplace, promoting wireless infrastructure deployments, and modernizing regulations to promote more fiber deployment. Since I'm speaking at Spectrum Conference, I'm going to focus most of my time on the spectrum aspect of our 5G Fast Plan, but I do want to touch on the other two components as they're critical for making sure that 5G actually gets deployed and gets deployed to the furthest reaches of our communities. Next slide, please. On the spectrum front, we've been very busy and very aggressive in pushing the airwaves into the commercial marketplace. As Hans noted in his introductory slides, the FCC has been taking a number of critical actions to make additional spectrum available for 5G services. With respect to the high band, which is what our panel is focusing on, the FCC has made auctioning this spectrum a top priority. the FCC concluded its first 5G spectrum auction in the 28 gigahertz band in January of 2019. We wrapped up our 24 gigahertz spectrum auction in May of 2019. And we finished our 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz spectrum auction in March of this year. I'll focus on the high band deployments on the next slide in a little bit of time, but I do want to mention some of the other important 5G spectrum that we've been turning to in both the mid and the low bands in the US. As we all know, mid-band spectrum has become a prime target for 5G build-out, and it is in the US like much of the world, given the balanced coverage and capacity characteristics. We've been working on the 2.5 gigahertz band, the 3.5 gigahertz band, and most recently the 3.7 to 4 gigahertz band. We want to hopefully make available up to 844 megahertz for 5G deployments in these mid bands. And we're aggressively looking at other opportunities there as well. With respect to low band, the FCC is acting to improve our use of low band spectrum for 5G services with targeted changes to the 600 megahertz, 800 megahertz, and 900 megahertz band. I'll note that our 700 megahertz band is also available for 5G use and has already been assigned to operators. And recognizing for a moment that unlicensed spectrum is going to be very important to 5G, I did want to note that the FCC is creating new opportunities for the next generation of Wi-Fi using the entire 6 gigahertz band from 5.925 to 7.125. We're also looking at the 60 gigahertz band and bands above 95 gigahertz for unlicensed use. In addition, the FCC voted in December of last year to take a fresh and comprehensive look at the 5.9 gigahertz band, proposing rule changes to ensure that that spectrum supports its highest and best use for the American public. Next slide, please. So I want to provide a little bit of detail on the total of 5 gigahertz of millimeter wave spectrum that we've made available for licensed terrestrial wireless use. First of all, it's important to note that in the US, we've adopted flexible use service rules. That means that we permit either fixed or mobile operations in the 5 bands that I'm going to talk about. And these have exclusive use license coverage geographic areas. In the 24 gigahertz band, we've allocated 7 100 megahertz blocks by what we call partial economic areas. These are areas that we use for auction purposes, and it divides the United States into 416 service areas geographically, larger than counties by 5 to 7 counties might fit into that type of a block, and it varies by region. In the 28 gigahertz band, we've auctioned 2 larger 425 megahertz blocks, and we've done that on a county-wide basis. And there are 3,233 counties in the US. For our upper 37 gigahertz band, we've utilized 10 100 megahertz blocks, and we've done that on the PEA basis. Our 39 gigahertz band has been auctioned using 14 100 megahertz blocks, again by a PEA. And the 47 gigahertz band was done in 10 100 megahertz blocks, again by PEAs. Under our rules, we have permitted use in the bands. Operators can do flexible service rules without obtaining new licenses. If you're an incumbent there, you can operate right away, and we saw that with our 28 gigahertz band, where the incumbents can go right forward and start operating under their new licenses. Interestingly, in our last auction, incumbents in the 39 gigahertz band were not able to coordinate among themselves in a traditional manner, so we came up with a incentive auction that allowed them to exchange their existing spectrum usage rights for new licenses, and that worked very well there. For the 24 gigahertz band, 37 and 47, those were relatively greenfield spectrum in the US, and relatively light incumbent use there. So quite busy auction in the past 1.5 years in the US. Put some results of the auctions and the winning total winning bids for each there for those that are interested. And I do want to note we are also not done there with high bands in the US. We're looking still, we have existing consultations on the 26 gigahertz band, the 42 gigahertz band, and the 50 gigahertz band. That's still open. We're also still in the process looking at the lower 37 gigahertz band, where we've established a licensing framework where we're sharing between commercial and federal government users, and that's still playing out right now. We started developing those rules. And again, consistent with our FCC philosophy of making all technologies available for our citizens, millimeter wave spectrum has also been allocated to other critical technologies, as others have noted in their remarks. For example, the FCC has made millimeter wave spectrum available for unlicensed use in the 57 to 71 gigahertz bands. And as we're seeing with the advent of the high throughput geostationary satellites and the numerous NGSO constellations that are wanting to provide broadband service globally, we are also providing spectrum for them in the millimeter wave bands. To that end, we have provided primary satellite use, including for end user devices, for satellites in the 40 to 42 gigahertz band and the 48.2 to 50.2 gigahertz band. And we're also providing opportunities, as Chris noted in his presentation, for satellite use in other bands, and specifically the 24 gigahertz band, 28 gigahertz band, 37.5 to 40 and 47 gigahertz bands, as well as in a portion of the 50 gigahertz band. Next slide, please. So as we provided spectrum for terrestrial use in 5G, we've also found that it's critical role, we need to provide spectrum for satellite services. And we're striving to find that right balance between satellite and terrestrial. In our Spectrum Frontiers consultations, we provided flexibility to our Earth station siting rules in the 28 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz. And we've also adopted some Earth station siting criteria in the 24 gigahertz band. We've also permitted individual stations in the 50.4 to 51.4 gigahertz band. We're very excited about the opportunities that satellite can also play. And to that end, we have done additional deployment mechanisms for Earth stations. For example, in our rules, we've granted status to any FSS Earth station for which the FSS operator also holds the UMFS license, whether through participation in an auction or purchased on the secondary markets, and where that might cover their Earth station's permitted interference zone. So gives a great other opportunity for satellites to utilize those bands. We've also adopted guidelines for future deployments. In June of this year, my bureau issued a public notice to provide some specific guidance on methodologies to implement one of the Commission's rules, which governs the conditions under which FSS Earth stations can operate in certain bands shared with UMFS. And we're hoping that we can find the right balance between satellite and terrestrial and fixed there. We also have done a number of other actions that are detailed on this slide, but I did want to spend a little bit of time going forward to some of the other areas. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So obviously spectrum is a key ingredient for 5G, as we've all noted, but without infrastructure, 5G cannot be provided. Next slide. So here we've detailed a brief overview of some of the new construction of wireless facilities and the co-location on existing structures where we have state or local approval that's being required and compliance with the FCC's environmental and historic preservation rules. Since 2017, the FCC has taken steps to accelerate deployment of wireless facilities by removing the regulatory barriers to infrastructure deployment. These actions include streamlining our wireless infrastructure siting review process, addressing the conduct of some state and local governments that needlessly slowed down and increased the cost of wireless infrastructure deployments, and modernizing the federal historic preservation and environmental reviews for wireless deployments. All of these in totality have been a significant accelerator for next generation wireless facility deployments in the US, and we're already seeing that pay dividends. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the third pillar of our 5G Fast Plan, which is modernizing our outdated regulations, where we want to promote fiber deployment. If you go to the next slide, as we've noted, 5G isn't just about wireless. We also need strong wired networks of fiber to carry all of the traffic once it's offloaded from the airwaves. So at the FCC, under this third pillar, we've modernized our rules to encourage the deployment of optical fiber for backhaul. We're making it easier for carriers to transition from maintaining yesterday's copper networks to building tomorrow's fiber networks. One key takeaway that we have learned and can share is that regulators should ensure they promote policies or initiatives to allow carriers to invest in modern networks rather than devote scarce resources to outmoded legacy services. If we go to the next slide, I'll start wrapping up.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
No problem. 5G, as we all know, will have vast implications. And to make that a reality, we want to make sure that 5G needs to make sure that connectivity, we need to not take risky choices and just hope for the best. We must address network security and safeguard personal and economic and national security. This is all the more apparent during the global pandemic, as we have seen our stadiums and arenas turned into field hospitals and the vital services of acute care hospitals jeopardized by ransomware attacks. And then to wrap up on the next slide, a few areas where we're looking at in the US with respect to network security. One area is supply chain integrity, where we are taking a trusted vendor approach with our networks. And we're also very focused on O-RAN as another possible means for network operators to ensure the security of their networks. And there I'll note an interesting example real quickly is the upcoming build out of Dish's 5G network, where Dish announced that it plans to deploy a 5G standalone network using a cloud native Open RAN architecture in the US, using vendors like VMware, Altiostar, Fujitsu, and Maven here. So thank you. I appreciate you letting me take a little bit more time.
No problem. Thank you, Tom. That's a very interesting summary of what's going on in the US. And I mean, it's certainly true that the FCC has pushed out a lot of spectrum in a very short space of time. And it's interesting to see how quickly that spectrum first was brought to the market, but also how quickly it is now being deployed by the likes of Verizon and AT&T. Now we're sort of running behind schedule a little bit, so I to move on to the next presentation real quickly. We have Chris Murphy from Viasat, who will give us the satellites industry's perspective on the results of WRC 19. Over to you, Chris.
Oh, thanks, Hans. Good afternoon, and good to see many friends here from both WRC, APT, and beyond. Viasat's a global internet services provider. We provide services through a large fleet of Ka-band satellites as well as via terrestrial networks. As you may know, Ka-band is part of the mmWave bands, and Viasat and many other satellite operators use the frequency range 17.7 to 20.2 and 27.5 to 30 gigahertz for most of our operations. Viasat's invested billions of dollars in our satellite networks within the Ka-band portion of the mmWave band to serve people anywhere and provide broadband services that will help close the digital divide, provide gate-to-gate and peer-to-peer services on aircraft and ships, and land mobile services such as trains, buses, and cars, which are flourishing today. The Ka-band and the 28 and 18 gigahertz bands in particular have been allocated to the fixed satellite service for several decades. And at WRC 15 and just recently concluded WRC 19, that allocation was extended to include Earth stations in motion, as part of the fixed satellite service throughout the band. These bands were specifically not identified for 5G or IMT by the last two conferences. We appreciate the over 120 countries that have allocated and assigned the 28 gigahertz band for satellite broadband, including in the Asia Pacific, countries like Indonesia, India, China, Australia, to name a few. These countries, along with Europe, Africa, Latin America, represent over 4.5 billion people and more than the majority of the world's population. With the global allocation of the Ka band for eSIM use, we're now connecting over 150 million devices per year on airplanes, under typical situation, of course. That's just our company as well. There's many, many more hundreds of millions of devices connected through other satellite providers as well. Through our residential and small business service, we're also serving millions of homes, small and large businesses, and individuals through our 5 geostationary satellites currently in orbit, and in partnerships around the world with other satellite operators. Like, for example, in Australia, we support the National Broadband Network's satellite component, and also in Australia, Qantas for gate-to-gate connectivity on their aircraft. As I said, Viasat's invested significantly in improving capacity and throughput via our newest generation of Ka-band satellites called Viasat 3s. Those will be launching in the next couple of years, and you will see massive increases in capacity. Each satellite will have a terabit of processing capability, and that means we can offer speeds up to 100 megabits per second per customer. This expanded capacity and required spectrum access allows for a significant improvement in bandwidth and ultimately lower cost per bit, for which we pass on to our consumers. Customers, sorry. We're also doubling down on our efforts, as are most others in the satellite industry, especially with other spectrum bands being having pressure put on them. So within the Ka band, we're developing networks that are high quality, high power, secure, and as I said, affordable, with fast connections just like you have in your home. And we're taking them to urban and rural areas alike. One way we're doing this is through business models such in going particularly to developing countries and bridging the digital divide, is through something we call Viasat's community internet. Our community internet model creates a local area hotspot network where an antenna is installed and allows a large number of people to connect very quickly. Often these are in villages and communities that have no connectivity or very little connectivity. And this aligns with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the ITU's Connect 2020 agenda. And Viasat's a strong believer in the power of connectivity and its potential to accelerate human progress and develop knowledge societies. So education, telemedicine, and other services are the kinds of applications that are being delivered through our technology today. As such, we continue to evolve and invest in innovative solutions that will contribute to bring down the cost per bit. That's our mission. By satellite-powered broadband and connect anyone, anywhere, whether on land, air, or at sea. In conclusion, I'd like to say that while Viasat's invested heavily in the band, the entire satellite community is continuing to grow at expanding exponential rates with new and innovative technologies in these bands. Maintaining the Ka band as a satellite band is critical for us and for the continued growth in space-based and broadband solutions that can reach areas it will never be economical for terrestrial services to reach, ultimately leaving communities on the wrong side of the digital divide. So we can solve this problem with the right regulatory policies, a little investment, and dedication to pushing the boundaries of what satellites can bring to bear. But the spectrum, particularly 28 gigahertz, is absolutely critical for being able to do that, achieve that mission around the world. I'll just conclude by saying I hope you'll watch our showcase presentation later in the week on day 4 on stage 2. It's titled Care, Connectivity, and Recovery in the Era of COVID. So it's a presentation about how satellite-powered telemedicine is changing the world that we live in today. With that, I'll thank you and pass it back to you, Hans.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this comprehensive summary of Viasat's views on the results on WSC19, but also your plans for the 28 gigahertz band. I'd like to now hand over to Jiranjin, who's the lead of the high band team at GSA, to give us an overview of the capabilities of 5G mmWave.
Okay. Thank you, Hans, and good day to you all. Hope you are safe from the virus. I really appreciate this opportunity to introduce the progress of 5G in high frequency bands. Now let's go to page 2, please. Yeah, we all know that 5G will work in a series of frequency bands from low band to mid band and to high bands. Various applications and services will require access to the spectrum from low, mid, and high bands at the same time. And here, the high bands are supposed to provide the ultra experience to the consumers, like ultra wide bandwidth, extreme high capacity, and data rates. And then next page, please. Let's recall a little bit about the last World Radio Conference. With the frequency bands of 26, 40, and 70 gigahertz identified to IMT, and here we may say 5G at global level. In total, WAC 19 made approximately 11 gigahertz available for IMT globally. And then next page. Sorry, please back to page 3. Yeah, yes. And in addition to the global identification, the conference also identified 45.5 to 47 gigahertz and also 47.2 to 48.2 gigahertz to IMT in terms of country footnotes on a primary basis. This means an additional 1.5 gigahertz and 1 gigahertz are identified in country footnotes respectively. And next page, please. And then in 3GPP, we can see we have the new red operating bands called FR2 from 24.25 gigahertz to 29.5 gigahertz, which is known as 26 and 28 gigahertz, and also 37 to 43.5 gigahertz. These high frequency bands will work in EMBB and UIRC scenarios, and we believe that 800 to 1000 megahertz per operator or network contiguous is needed from this year or next year. And an additional high frequency bands spectrum may be required by operators by 2023 or 2025. And next page, please. And now we can take a look at the examples of global progress of high frequency band plan. And here we showed some progress in Europe, Americas, Middle East, and Africa for 26 and 28 gigahertz. Here the red bar indicates the band assigned to 5G already, and the light green bars are those under consultation by administrations, and the yellow ones indicate they are under consideration. So in another word, a large number of licenses are to be issued or made to be issued within 24.25 to 29.5 gigahertz range in this year or next year timeframe. And then in next page, let's take a look at the progress in Asia Pacific area. several administrations have assigned this range or portions thereof to 5G, and some are still conducting consultations. So from this chart, it is very encouraging, and we are expecting more bars will be added, maybe red or maybe yellow or green in this chart in the very near future. Next page, please. Okay, after talking about the 5G spectrum, I would like to mention a little about the standards for 5G. The 5G 3GPP specification, we know release 16 are now completed, and also enhancements in release 17 are underway. And during last Working Party 5D meeting in June, the 3GPP technologies, we call it RIT or SRIT, have been accepted as the IMT 2020 radio interface technology. Of course, the recommendation is planned to be finalized in this October, but please allow me to say that the 5G standard now is already ready. Okay, next page, please. And here we show part of the 5G mmWave commercial products which are ready for the market, and from chipset to hotspots, CPE, 5G modules. And I believe people would be more curious about the mobile phones. So you can see there are several models here. They all support the mmWave bands, and most are 26 and 28 gigahertz. And then in next page, regarding the 5G network, from a global view, we expect the 5G development or deployment would happen much faster than 4G, comparing the first year of the deployment for both technologies. And in particular here in the picture, we can see some operators plan to have or have already started 5G in mmWave bands. And of course, this is not the latest information. One or two operators are not marked in the map, like the Antel in South America. And next page, please. This is an example of Verizon's 5G mmWave deployment. Verizon now is providing 5G ultra-band experience to users in 17 NFL stadiums using mmWave technology. And the phone's home access points are also available to customers from Verizon. Okay, next page, please. Yeah, with all those I mentioned, from spectrum to standards to the network and also the user equipments, we can say things for 26 and 28 gigahertz are almost ready. But to provide a stable and a reliable 5G in these two bands, we would like to express our views on relative technical conditions, which are very hot topics now and also mentioned by our speakers previously. We welcome the outcome of WAC 19 regarding the unwanted emission limits from 26 gigahertz band to protect the ES passive service in 23 gigahertz. And this is a global compromise based on the balancing of the need of all radio users, both terrestrial and satellites. And from a 5G perspective, this enables the benefits of global economy of scale to be released. And the GSA will honor the WAC 19 agreement, and we believe that this agreement should be followed. And regarding 28 gigahertz, we are of the view that the OOB limits as the outcome of WAC 19 and also in-band ERP limits for 26 gigahertz do not affect the 5G stations in 28 gigahertz. And we are also of the view that eSIM operation shall protect 5G stations operating in 28 gigahertz. And these protections should be guided by national regulation within the territory of an administration and guided by WAC 19 resolution for cross-border situations. Yeah, next page, please. And as conclusion, the low, mid, and high bands will all be needed for 5G at the same time. And as the high band team lead, I would like to say everything for 5G in high frequency bands is already ready. And a significant number of countries will license spectrum within the 24.25 to 29.5 gigahertz range in the 2020 and the 2021 timeframe. And also spectrum within the 37 to 43.5 gigahertz range will become more prominent as administrations license or develop frequency arrangements. And finally, GSA supports Asia-Pacific countries to roll out 5G using millimeter wave technologies. And if you need any help or support, we are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jiran. And thank you very much to all the speakers. This concludes the formal part, and we now are going to launch into a conversation. And we've got lots of questions from the floor, and we've also asked a couple of questions and put a number of polls to the audience, which we're going to go through now. First of all, I'd like to ask speakers whether there's anything that they have picked up on in the other presentations that they would like to comment on before we move on. So just raise your hand if there's anything immediate. No? Okay, great. Next, I'd like to go through the results of the polls we posted. The first one is for Linda, Tom, and Chris Hose. I mean, you've all grappled with the question of what an appropriate authorization regime should look like for millimeter wave spectrum. And we posted 2 polls on this question, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the results. So the first one, if I can find it, is what licensing models do you think will be best suited for millimeter wave spectrum? Shared for maximum flexibility, 33%. Exclusive use for maximum protection of investments, 13%. The club model, which is used in Italy, received 2% of the votes, and a mixture of shared and exclusive use licenses received 52% of the votes. The second question was on, or maybe we'll start with that one first. Linda, Chris, Tom.
I'm happy to go first. Look, I'm not surprised by that. As you've seen for what we've done in Australia, we've taken the opportunity to adopt a mixed approach with varying different authorization regimes to support different uses and user categories. So the mixed approach showing up as 52% probably doesn't surprise me. It's what we've tried to do in Australia to the extent we can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true in the US as well. Although when we auction the actual bands for 5G use in what we call UMFIS in the US, obviously they're done on an exclusive basis. However, as I noted in my presentation, we do provide opportunities for earth stations and the gateways to utilize those bands in under our rules. So the Commission has seen a way to kind of navigate both areas as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, so the mixed approach, I think, is the get the most in the poll is reasonable because it all depends on the circumstances of the case. In our case, we use administrative assignment all through because we release all the 26 and 28 bands together. So there are a lot of which. So there are so much spectrum out in the market, 4,100. So that we have to use administrative assignment because even when we do it this way, there's still spectrum left over. So if we put it to auction, it's unreasonable. The market-based approach is applicable only when the demand exceeds supply. Then we have to lead the market to resolve how to distribute the sought after resources. But when the resources are so much, then there's no point in going out for auction. I think we have much more supply than other countries because I see some of them, they release like the N257, the upper band first because that is the band that with equipment support earlier than the lower band.
Yes,
So
yeah,
that's
understood.
different, yeah.
Because of the overlap of 28.
Yeah.
Now, the second question, thank you very much, Linda. The second question in relation to authorization regimes was on the geographic area that should be licensed. So what geographic licensing areas do you think will work best for millimeter wave spectrum? Site-specific local received 52% of the vote, regional 26%, and national, potentially with subleasing, received 22% of the vote. Chris Howes, would you like to go first? That again.
Thanks. Yeah, sure. Look, again, I think it obviously depends on the individual circumstances of the country and the geography and the demographics. In Australia, as I illustrated, we've, in terms of our long-term, what we call spectrum licenses, we've determined for the likely use of the millimeter wave bands and propagation characteristics and so forth. The long-term licenses, we've adopted quite localized licenses, so covering cities and smaller geographic areas as opposed to other bands where we might have done nationwide. That said, outside of those areas where we're going to allocate long-term spectrum licenses, we will make available highly localized apparatus licenses where necessary, which people can build up to the areas that they need. So again, it's a bit of a mix and horses for courses, as they say. Thanks.
Anything? Thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Tom or Linda?
Yes, I say something about the very special Hong Kong geographic characteristic. You know, we are very small, so we don't used to have regional or geographic specific assignment. So for the public mobile service for large scale, that is for the territory-wide application for the whole Hong Kong area. But what we can expect is the operator will install the 26, 28 gigahertz base station for the hotspot use only for high capacity usage. And this is the first time you see from my presentation that there is 400 megahertz share spectrum that is for specific location. That is very special because it is more alike for private use and for specific innovative service. So this is different kind of thinking for the general, for the public mobile service. We cannot do it like for Hong Kong, for Kowloon and New Territories because we are so close. So we are for territory-wide use, but we don't expect the operator to push the 26, 28 gigahertz base station everywhere, but to the location that they want to solve the capacity problem.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much.
The only thing I would add, Hans, would be obviously I agree that it has to be done by each country's own unique characteristics and how they do their licensing regimes. I would also add the other dimension depends on the spectrum and the incumbent use and how it's done geographically. So in our example in the US, we've done these larger partial economic areas in some cases, but we've also done smaller regimes like counties on others, and it really is dependent on who the incumbents are and what are the unique characteristics of that particular auction, which is how we do our allocation model in the US. So, thank you.
But is it in the US, you also have some regional license? It's quite common to have the regional license for other
That's
bands.
right, Linda. Yeah, those are what we call more the PEAs, the partial economic areas, and those are the larger aggregations of regions or subregions of the US.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
Now, Chris Murphy and Jiran, the third poll we posted was on the importance of millimeter wave in the delivery of 5G services. The question we asked was, when do you think millimeter wave will start playing a key role in the delivery of 5G services in your country? Within the next 5 years, 44% of the vote, not immediately, at least 5 to 10 years from now, 31% of the vote, and unclear at this point, 25% of the vote. What are your immediate thoughts on these results?
Should I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think the jury is still out. I think that the propagation characteristics, the ability to go through trees, through weather, through windows, and the amount of infrastructure that's required, I think as I was listening to the previous panel and then our panel as well, it's really unclear where millimeter wave is going in terms of large scale deployments. So as far as mobile services are concerned. So I think we're still going to have to see where that goes. But 26, 40, 50, 66 gigahertz, there's 17 gigahertz of spectrum to experiment with. Of course, I'll be clear, I think 28 is not on the table. That's going to be a satellite band, and we're very much looking forward to working with using 5G technology, but not in the 28 gigahertz band.
Thank you, Chris. And Jiran.
Yeah, thank you, Hans. Well, I'm not surprised to see the result of the poll up, and it indicates that the user requirements or the demand of the users, our clients, will determine the 5G in the future, the development. So from the high band perspective, we believe that it will bring the extreme experience to the clients, to the users, and with the time passes, we can see the demand is climbing, and especially in this such period of pandemic, apparently we are having the virtual conferences and relative demands will climbing up. So let's see. I think the expectation will come up, and the requirements to the millimeter wave bands will also come up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to now go through a few questions that we've received from the audience. The first one is from Nis Pavati from Qualcomm. One for Tom. What kind of incentive? So a bit more information about the incentive auction that the FCC ran in the 39 gigahertz band.
Sure. Thank you for the question. That incentive auction was a result of the fact that we had some incumbents in the 39 gigahertz band who had fixed microwave licenses, which were essentially trapezoidal in their shape, and they did not marry up to how we typically do our auctions, which is in the partial economic areas. So we provided an opportunity for them to essentially relinquish their licenses in exchange for bidding credits, so that they could either gain revenue or they could get a license elsewhere in the 47 gigahertz band or elsewhere in the 37 to 39 gigahertz bands. Many of those operators were already in the terrestrial users themselves. So for some of them, it was just an internal reshuffling, and they got bidding credits. Others used it as an opportunity to receive economic compensation. And you can find more about that. It's fcc.gov auction 103. And it'll go through the precise mechanism if anyone's interested.
If I understand correctly, it worked a treat. All the existing holders effectively returned their licenses in exchange for these bidding credits, and you could actually clear the band and reconfigure it to get large contiguous holdings.
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Question 2 for Chris Murphy, I think. Here, Bashir Patel from Viasat asks, since WSC 19 created 2 satellite agenda items in 28 gigahertz, building on GSO eSIM outcome, can we take it that 28 gigahertz band is becoming established for satellite services and not terrestrial or 5G?
Well, I think you know my answer to that. It's a resounding yes. I think that's exactly what we're seeing. We saw at WRC 19, eSIM, a footnote adopted to allocate the 28 gigahertz band for eSIMs. and take into account in those rare cross-border neighboring country cases where there may be existing and operational terrestrial services, a protection mechanism for that. But countries are adopting satellite eSIMs regimes domestically now in most countries in the world. And WRC 23 will look at 2 additional items to further consolidate the band for satellite for NGSOs, for eSIMs, and for inter-satellite links for satellite to satellite links. So all we're seeing is, just like the terrestrial services, growth for satellite in the 28 gigahertz band.
Great, thank you very much.
Sorry.
Now, yep. Oh, sorry. Yes,
Sorry,
please, Jiran.
Not against you, Chris, but I like to remind that there are networks, terrestrial networks using 28 gigahertz, and we can take it within the ITU framework to have further discussion on that, and we can see we have several agenda items related to these bands in the next WAC conference. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
And I would just like to point out from the US perspective that we've done both. It can be both. And we've allocated a portion of the band to mobile fixed use and the remainder to satellite use. So I know doesn't stop the debate, but I do think there are opportunities for both, and regulators should look to see how you can accommodate and maximize the interests of both.
I was just going to sort of say something similar. I think the key thing is it doesn't necessarily need to be viewed as a binary choice, particularly in these bands and these circumstances. The ITU allocations are there for guidance, and individual countries need to make their decisions on their domestic needs. But yeah, absolutely, you can do both, and don't need to make a binary choice, that black and white. So just support those comments.
Thank you, both Chris's and Tom and Jiran. Okay. Third question. I think this will be the final one. It's from Stefan Zähler, Colliago Consulting. What does the panel think is driving the difference in demand for millimeter wave spectrum between the US, where Verizon bought gigahertz in the 37 to 39 gigahertz band, and Hong Kong, where only 3 operators only applied for 400 megahertz each?
Maybe I get some background and explanation of how I understand my operator, why they are so conservative. Because to be honest, we have 4 operators. One who prepared the application, and in the end, it decided not to submit the application. Because I think the reason is, but our assignment of the 26, 28 gigahertz band in 2019, early 2019 April already, and that is earlier than the 3.5 gigahertz band. So that is 1 year time lag. So they are thinking, should they get the millimeter wave band first ahead of the mid-band spectrum? It is a strategy of how they build their mobile network, how they build the 5G network. And also, as I said, the uncertainty by that time in early 2019, the uncertainty of applying the 28 gigahertz band is much higher than nowadays. So, and coupled with the arrangement that we don't want to push them to decide in the midst of uncertainty, we are prepared to launch a second round of application in 2 years' time. That is by the end of this year, after the assignment of the mid-band spectrum. And that's why by that time, they apply for 400. That is, they get some to get some feel of how this is used. And I saw the application for the installation of base station. They do installing the base station, applying application for the base station installment nowadays. So I think it is why we get so few assignment is because of the timing for the mid-band and the millimeter wave band, and also the development strategy, because we all know for the millimeter wave spectrum,
800 megahertz is the optimal for delivering the optimal speed. So theoretically, they should need 800 megahertz, and that's why we set the spectrum cap at 800 megahertz. So you will know by the time we launch the second invitation, and the result will be known early next year.
Yeah, I have one very final, very quick follow-up question, because I think what Stefan's question is sort of driving at was the lack of mid-band spectrum in the US for some time. So just wondering whether Tom, I mean, for a long time it was unclear whether and how much C-band spectrum mobile operators were actually going to be able to acquire in the US, in particular 3.7 to 4 gigahertz. Do you think that the recent decision by the FCC to auction this band has taken the pressure off to deploy in the millimeter wave bands, or do you think that won't have an impact on the rollout strategies?
I don't think it'll have I don't think it'll take the pressure off. I think the operators in the U.S. are excited about all of the spectrum opportunities that we've put out, including the millimeter wave bands, as you can see by the number of bidders, the different types of bidders who are looking to utilize that spectrum. Not just for the traditional mobile operators, but we also have those who are interested in some fixed wireless applications who've successfully won large portions of that as well. The mid-band spectrum is key. As we all know, it's going to take a mix of the low, mid, and high for network operators to successfully roll out 5G. So our push on mid-band is going to help to keep that supply going, but I don't think it's going to take the pressure off. And as we've seen from some of the tests and trials in the US, the combination of all three of those bands really does deliver the high performance, high capacity that 5G is promising. So we're excited to keep pushing out that spectrum. And I think it's not going to take the pressure off. Companies are rolling out those millimeter wave deployments as we speak.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think we're running out of time here, so I'd just like to thank everyone again for the excellent presentation. Fantastic session. We got lots of different perspectives on millimeter wave, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. So yeah, apologies guys. We could have carried on that session for a lot longer, and really sorry that we are out of time, but really interesting discussion, really interesting perspectives from everyone. So appreciate all of your time, all of your comments, all of your thoughts, and thank you again to everybody out there for your questions for the panelists as well. So a really interesting session again. So next up, we are now moving on to the last sessions of today's proceedings. We're now moving on to the showcase sessions. So we have the two showcase sessions which are running for you today. So you have a choice of attending either showcase stage 1, where Nokia are hosting a session which is looking at private wireless as a key enabler for enterprise digital transformation, or showcase stage 2, where the Global Satellite Coalition are running a showcase that's focusing on spectrum, or the question of spectrum, and whether that's the answer to Asia Pacific's connectivity questions. So really, two really interesting showcase sessions there. So please do make your way to either of those. Once again, for anybody who is experiencing any connectivity issues, both of these are being streamed live on YouTube. So if you go into the session, there will be a link posted on the session, which will give you a link to YouTube. But hopefully no one is experiencing the issues, but anyone does, then that is an option there, so you can follow the link there. But once again, thank you so much to all of our speakers and panelists today. Thank you so much to all of you for your participation. Quick reminder, tomorrow we start again at the same time at 1 p.m. Jakarta time, where we are going to be focusing, well, starting off with a presentation which is going to be looking at AR and VR, and whether that's the next killer app for 5G. And then we're switching to mid-band spectrum. We have a session on C-band, and then a session more generally on other possible options for mid-band spectrum for 5G. So more really interesting discussions to come tomorrow. But in the meantime, thank you all so much again for your participation today. Please do make your way over now to one of the showcase sessions. And yeah, looking forward to those coming up shortly. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you again tomorrow. Thank you.